In the autumn of 1943, the American armored forces faced a crisis that threatened to undermine the entire invasion of Europe. The crisis was not numerical. American tank production was impressive, outstripping German production by a significant margin. The crisis was qualitative. American tanks, primarily the M4 Sherman, were being systematically outclassed by German heavy tanks, particularly the Panther and the Tiger. The statistics were brutal and undeniable. It took an average of 5 Sherman tanks to destroy a single German Panther. 5 tanks meant 5 crews, meant 25 men. 25 men to destroy 1 German tank. This was a mathematical impossibility. No amount of industrial production could sustain such losses. If the pattern continued, Germany would lose the war through attrition. But the cost in American lives would be staggering. American tankers called the Sherman by various names, none of them flattering. Tommy Cooker, after the British cigarette lighter company. Ronson, after the cigarette lighter advertisement light's first time. Every time, the darker humour suggested that the Sherman was a death trap, a mobile coffin, a vehicle that existed primarily to deliver American soldiers to their deaths in a blaze of armour-piercing fire from German guns. The problem was fundamental. The Sherman was designed as a general-purpose tank, capable of fulfilling multiple roles. It prioritized reliability, ease of production, and ease of maintenance over armour protection and firepower. The German Panther, by contrast, was designed as a tank killer, optimized for firepower and armour at the expense of reliability and ease of production. In a conventional engagement at range, the Sherman lost every time. A Panther could penetrate Sherman armour from over a mile away. A Sherman had to get within 300 yards to have any chance of penetrating Panther armour. 300 yards is effectively close range for tank combat. 300 yards is the distance at which a Panther could put multiple rounds into a Sherman before the Sherman got off a single effective shot. By late 1943, American military planners had concluded that something drastic had to change. They couldn't simply produce more Shermans and hope that numerical superiority would eventually overcome German quality. They needed a technological solution. They needed a way to give the Sherman a fighting chance against German heavy armour. The answer came from an unlikely source. A team of American metallurgists and ballistics engineers working in near-total secrecy. These men posed a fundamental question. What if instead of trying to make the Sherman heavier or more powerful, they created ammunition that could penetrate German armour more effectively? What if they used materials that were rare but far more effective than conventional steel? The answer was tungsten. Tungsten is one of the hardest metals known to man. It is more than twice as dense as steel. When formed into a narrow penetrator and given sufficient velocity, tungsten can punch through armour that would stop conventional steel rounds as if the armour wasn't there. The concept was not new. German designers had experimented with tungsten-cored ammunition, but the Germans faced a problem that the Americans did not initially appreciate. Tungsten is rare, extremely rare. Germany had limited access to tungsten supplies. By 1943, with German resources stretched thin across multiple theatres and multiple weapons programs, tungsten was not a priority. German designers had abandoned the tungsten-cored round in favour of other approaches. The Americans, by contrast, recognized tungsten's potential and were willing to pay the price. The cost in rare materials was enormous. Every tungsten-cored round represented strategic materials that could have been used for other weapons programs. Every round represented a calculation that the value of giving Sherman tanks a fighting chance was worth the cost in rare materials. The result was the M93 high-velocity armour-piercing round, HVAP for short. The design was elegant in its simplicity. A dense tungsten carbide core wrapped in a lighter aluminum ballistic cap. The tungsten core would penetrate armour. The aluminum cap would stabilize the round in flight and help it break away on impact, allowing the tungsten to do its work inside the tank. But there was a problem. Tungsten was so rare that production could not keep up with demand. The decision was made to produce HVAP rounds in limited quantities. They would be distributed sparingly, only to units facing the heaviest German armour. Each tank would receive a limited allocation, perhaps a dozen rounds per tank. Those rounds would have to count. The first HVAP rounds began arriving at tank units in early 1944, just weeks before the Normandy invasion. Tank crews received minimal briefing on the new ammunition. There was no time for extensive training. There was no time for elaborate testing. The rounds simply appeared in ammunition racks with cryptic instructions to use them against heavy armor. The first major test came at the Battle of Aracourt in September 1944. American tanks equipped with HVAP ammunition engaged German Panthers and Panther Is across open terrain. What happened in the following 10 days would reshape the entire tank war in Europe. American Sherman crews discovered that with HVAP rounds, they could penetrate Panther armor from ranges that previously would have been suicidal. 600 meters, 700 meters, ranges at which a Sherman had previously been helpless. Suddenly, Shermans could fight back. Suddenly, Shermans could kill Panthers. Not every time, but enough times that German tank crews began to realize that their armor advantage had evaporated. German after-action reports from Aracourt showed increasing confusion and concern. One captured Panther commander reported that his tank had been penetrated from the front at 600 meters. The report was marked with a question mark and a notation that said impossible, but it wasn't impossible. It was HVAP. The impact on tank tactics was immediate and profound. German tank crews, who had previously been confident in the superiority of their armor, suddenly found themselves vulnerable. They began taking different positions. They stopped advancing into open terrain where Shermans could engage them at range. They began seeking ambush positions where they could use their superior firepower at close range. But American tankers, understanding that they now had a fighting chance, began adapting their tactics accordingly. They used terrain to their advantage. They used superior numbers more effectively. They used the knowledge that their HVAP rounds could penetrate German armor to take risks they would previously never have taken. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. For months, Sherman crews had felt helpless against German heavy armor. They had developed tactics based on the assumption that they couldn't win a straight fight, ambush, flank, attack in overwhelming numbers, accept casualties. Now, suddenly, those tactics were no longer necessary. A Sherman with HVAP rounds could stand and fight, but the scarcity of HVAP rounds created tactical dilemmas of its own. Tank commanders faced agonizing decisions. Do you fire your HVAP rounds at the first Panther you see, knowing you might encounter more later? Or do you hold them in reserve and risk being destroyed by a Panther you could have killed if you'd had the courage to use your ammunition? One tank commander, interviewed after the war, described the psychological burden. Every time we saw a heavy tank, we had to make a calculation, he said. We had maybe a dozen HVAP rounds. We didn't know how many Panthers we would face. We didn't know if we would survive the encounter or die in it. Every round had to count. Every decision had to be right. Because if you guessed wrong, if you saved rounds for a fight that never came or wasted them in a fight you didn't need to win, your crew would pay the price. The German response to HVAP ammunition was initially dismissive. German commanders believed that the effect was exaggerated, that American claims of penetrations at long range were propaganda. But the evidence mounted. Tank after tank, Panther after Panther, German armor that had seemed invulnerable was being penetrated by American guns. German engineers proposed solutions: thicker armor, different armor angles, new tank designs with even heavier protection. But there was a problem. Germany was running out of steel. Germany was running out of fuel. Germany was running out of time. By late 1944, with the Red Army advancing from the east and the Western Allies pushing from the west, Germany could not afford to redesign its tank fleet. Germany could not afford to wait for new armor schemes to be developed and tested. Germany could only fight with what it had, and what it had was increasingly vulnerable to HVAP ammunition. By the spring of 1945, HVAP rounds had become the standard anti-tank ammunition for American Sherman crews. Production had increased somewhat, though never enough to satisfy demand. Tank crews hoarded HVAP rounds, trading cigarettes and whiskey with supply officers to acquire extra ammunition. HVAP rounds were rationed more strictly than almost any other ammunition in the American arsenal because the strategic materials they required were so valuable. The strategic value of tungsten meant that HVAP production was coordinated at the highest levels of government. Each round represented a calculation that the military value of penetrating German armor outweighed the potential civilian or industrial use of the same tungsten. In a real sense, every HVAP round fired at a German tank represented a decision by American military planners that tank combat was more important than other strategic priorities. German intelligence eventually caught up with reality. By late 1944, German military intelligence had concluded that American tanks were indeed armed with tungsten-cored ammunition. The question became not whether this was happening, but why it had taken so long to recognize the threat and why German designers had abandoned tungsten in favor of other approaches. The answer was partly strategic and partly a matter of ideology. Germany had always believed in quality over quantity. German designs were more complex, more demanding to produce, more difficult to maintain, but they were superior in individual performance. German military planners had believed that this superior performance would be enough. They had believed that German tanks, fewer in number but superior in quality, would prevail over American tanks, numerous but inferior in individual performance. They had not anticipated that American industrial capacity could produce not only large numbers of tanks, but also sophisticated ammunition using rare materials to enhance those tanks' capability. They had not anticipated that American tankers, despite being less experienced than German tankers, could be trained to use superior ammunition effectively. They had not anticipated that American determination and American resources would ultimately overcome German technical superiority. By the end of the war, estimates suggested that HVAP ammunition had been responsible for the destruction or disabling of over 200 German tanks. 200 tanks. That represented hundreds of German tankers killed or captured. That represented German armor that could not be replaced. That represented a loss of capability that Germany could not afford. The HVAP round was not the only factor in the eventual Allied victory in tank warfare. Superior tactics, superior training, superior leadership, and sheer numerical superiority all played roles. But the HVAP round represented something crucial. It represented American willingness to spend strategic resources to give frontline soldiers a better chance of surviving combat. It represented American engineering applied to a specific military problem. It represented innovation under pressure. The German response to HVAP ammunition had been insufficient because German strategic planning had been based on assumptions that proved incorrect. The assumption that American industry could produce quantity but not quality was wrong. The assumption that German technical superiority would be sufficient was wrong. The assumption that American tankers would lack the training and determination to use advanced ammunition effectively was wrong. In the end, the HVAP round proved to be one of the most consequential pieces of ammunition developed during World War II. It was never used in the quantities that tank commanders wanted. It was never available in sufficient quantities to equip every Sherman with a full basic load of HVAP rounds. But in the engagements where it was used, it proved decisively that American tanks could kill German heavy tanks, and in proving that, it changed the entire tank war in Europe. The HVAP round represented the moment when German technical superiority met American industrial capacity and American engineering innovation. And American industrial capacity and engineering innovation proved to be more than sufficient to overcome German technical superiority. It proved that sometimes the secret weapon is not a dramatic new tank design or a revolutionary new tactical approach. Sometimes the secret weapon is ammunition, sophisticated, expensive ammunition made from rare materials, designed by engineers who understood what would penetrate German armor. Ammunition that gave Sherman crews a fighting chance, and in warfare, a fighting chance is sometimes all that's needed.